Yeah, so thanks to the Madam Chair and the ranking member. I never done this before, but I move that S576, the Railway Safety Act 2023, as amended by the Cantwell-Vance substitute, is modified. Blackburn 2 is modified. Bud 2 is modified. Bud 4, Hicklin Hooper 1 is modified. Peters 1 is modified. Thune 2 is modified. Warnock 4 is modified. Warnock 6 is modified. And Welch 2 is modified. Be reported favorably out of the committee.
Is there a second?
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes. Is there discussion? Now we expect amendments to that. Yep.
Madam Chair,
Senator Vance, would you like to make any comments?
I would, and I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks again to the chair and to the ranking member for their work on this. Let me just start by trying to walk anyone who's listening through what the firefighters in East Palestine dealt with on the evening of the crash. This is a nearly all volunteer firefighting force, and they were asked to go into a burning inferno, not knowing what they were actually dealing with. Now, they learned later, that a number of hazardous chemicals were on board the train. They had no notice of that going in. They did their duty, and it's time for all of us on this committee and in this body to do ours. The first thing that this bill does, and in my view, the most important thing this bill does, is it ensures that our firefighters and our first responders have proper notice. We cannot ask our rural communities or our big cities to send their first responders into a train crash that they didn't cause, no fault of their own, without actually knowing what they're dealing with. That is the first and most important thing this legislation does, but it does a couple of other things as well. The second thing our legislation does, I would draw attention to, is that it provides enhanced safety inspections and monitoring to ensure what happens in East Palestine doesn't happen again, or at the very least, to make it less likely. We heard the leadership of the American Association of Railroads. I admire their honesty for this, for admitting that 30 seconds is not nearly enough time to inspect a rail car before it goes into our communities. Our legislation would make these inspections more rigorous. It would actually enable there to be more time for these inspections, and it would make it more likely that inspectors catch the things that cause these trains to go off the tracks in the first place. The second thing that it does is encourage the installation of hot box detectors all around our country so that the very thing that caused the East Palestine train to crash is noticed and fixed before it causes a chemical bomb to go off in communities like those in East Palestine. Now, let me say here, what happened in East Palestine cannot be undone. We cannot reverse it. We cannot change it. We cannot undo the psychological, economic, and physical toll of the derailment in East Palestine, but I guarantee you, whether it's tomorrow or next week or next year, there will be another East Palestine in this country if we do not pass the Railway Safety Act. It's that simple. Train crashes over the last 10 years have gone up 25% in our freight train across all rail since 2020. We have had more crashes successively, year after year for 3 years. Our rail system is becoming less safe, not more safe. We have the technology and we have the tools to change that. This bill does it, and we need to see it through. Now, I've heard a lot from my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, about this legislation over the last couple of months. I've learned a lot about rail regulation and rail safety that I never thought that I would know 6 months ago. This bill has changed a lot from what I introduced just a few short months ago. We've made a number of concessions to industry, a number of concessions to the rail industry, a number of concessions to various interest groups, which is why we have so much bipartisan support in this body, but also why we have a lot of support from industry. I want to address, we also have, by the way, the support of the Heritage Foundation. We have the support of Russ Vought, one of the most important leaders in the conservative movement. We have the support of Donald Trump, the former president, who had a deep emotional connection to the people of East Palestine and is asking this committee not for vague promises from industry, but that we get something done, that we do the job of legislators and actually legislate. I want to address just two concerns the ranking member addressed. I might go a little over my time. I hope that's okay, Madam Chair. The first is this question of whether this bill will make it harder and will empower the Biden administration to to prevent the transportation of coal and of other materials by rail. I don't think that's a fair characterization of our legislation. In fact, if you look at the number of industry groups, including the Chemical Council, that have come out in support of our legislation, they would not be supporting it if they thought it would make it impossible to transport their product by rail. Yes, it may make rail transportation a little bit more expensive, but it's going to make rail transportation a little bit more expensive in the service of safety, because let's be honest, we have allowed the rail industry to socialize the risk of their business while privatizing the rewards. The people of East Palestine are going to deal with the costs of what Norfolk Southern did for the next generation. The mental health costs, the physical health costs, the economic damage, the loss of home and property values, they will be dealing with this for 20 years hence. The least that we can do is make it less likely that the next East Palestine happens in our communities. We cannot, on the one hand, acknowledge that Ohio taxpayers and Ohio citizens are bearing the cost of this accident, and on the other hand, say it's ridiculous to require the rail industry to do a little bit more on safety. They should be doing more on safety. They should be incurring some additional costs so that another East Palestine doesn't happen again. The final point that I want to make here is the ranking member talked about the discretion given to the Biden administration. The ranking member himself has supported a number of pieces of legislation, even out of this committee, that give plenty of discretion to the Biden administration, including giving the Biden administration discretion over things like capital gains tax cuts for tech CEOs. If we can give the secretary discretion over capital gains tax cuts for CEOs, surely we can give the secretary discretion to make communities like East Palestine safer. I think it's ridiculous to say that we're going to discover a principle when that principle would protect the people of East Palestine and ignore that principle when it benefits tech CEOs and others who get capital gains tax cuts. So let's do something here. Let's not rely on vague promises. Let's not send out celebratory press releases because industry has finally decided to make a promise, not to follow through on that promise, but to make a promise. Let's actually do something for the people of East Palestine and all across our country. Let's get the Railway Safety Act done. It's common sense. It's a very narrow piece of legislation tailored to what we need to do to make rail safety a reality in this country. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar.
Yeah, well said, Senator Vance, well said. I appreciate your willingness to work with Senator Brown. I appreciate the fact that you have gotten a number